Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to the...
Broadcast from later, live from the hyper-present, Udit Vera, Sam Venus, Macy Sue, me, Robert Bolton, and joining us today is Sydney Allen Ash, a curious mind. She runs global internal communications things at Vice Media, an athlete, a host of the Research podcast and the new podcast Toenails, a podcast about running and also not running. Weak signals are things we notice on the peripheries of our radar, things we don't really understand yet, but we suspect may challenge the status quo ideas of what the future's unfolding might be like. Each of us brought in a weak signal. We do not know each other's signals in advance. We just do our best to unpack, make sense, speculate, and remind ourselves of the refrain, I don't know anything. Sam, what's your weakest signal?
So it's tied to this book, which is about to be released, called Cynical Theories. It was written by these two authors named Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. And basically, these were the two authors who were at the center of this, of the Grievance Studies affair, which was released a few years ago. So the Grievance Studies affair, for those of you who don't know, is basically a couple academics, these two in particular, plus this guy named Ben Hoff, I forget his name exactly. They were trying to poke holes in sort of critical theory and postmodernism and sort of social justice, and like show how aspects of the academy had been compromised by political motives. So like particularly like gender studies department, race department, fat studies, like a number of different research modalities. And they basically wrote a bunch of bogus papers that were politically motivated, that they took really extreme stances. So they made an argument in one of them that like dog humping incidents can be taken as evidence of rape culture. So they sort of like went really to the extreme and submitted it to all these like legit academic papers to see if they would be accepted. They submitted 20 papers that were accepted and published. And it was this whole scandal that was released. They're sort of rolling off that and have written a new book, which looks at the sort of intellectual and roots of postmodernism. And they describe sort of three phases of postmodernism that sort of starts with Foucault, comes to like modern social justice theory. And what I find interesting about this and the book release is that a few of the people that I've seen writing about it have made the argument that this is sort of like the consolidation of the intellectual dark web into a sort of like coherent political philosophy that's roughly rooted around like a traditional defense of liberalism, but has like different principles and a specific critique of aspects of like critical theory and postmodernism. So the question is like, is it possible to form like a coherent position around this type of thing? Is this actually a signal of like a new phase of the culture war, or is it just noise? Another formulation of the same critique that, you know, people have been making for the last few years.
For just a quick background before we jump in, the consolidation of the intellectual dark web idea there is interesting. Can you just give an idea of that term and who coined it and so on?
Yeah, so the intellectual dark web is a term that was coined by Eric Weinstein of the podcast, The Portal. He also is the managing director of Thiel Capital. So he manages Peter Thiel's money. Sort of leaning into this idea of the dark web, it's sort of like orienting a number of thinkers, including like Jonathan Chait, Jordan Peterson was part of it, Sam Harris was like loosely connected to it, around sort of pushing back against social justice theory and arguing basically from the left, taking a critical view of the further left, trying to dismantle some of the more radical aspects of critical justice theory. I don't know if that's a great description, but
I don't know if they necessarily have the same political beliefs. I guess like one similar like through line, I guess, through their beliefs would be classical liberalism, free thought, this idea that, you know, we need like free and open discourse as part of keeping a democracy thriving and keeping the culture kind of alive and dynamic. You know, there are a number of people involved or might be considered part of the intellectual dark web, like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, which, you know, you can clearly see they're not have this necessarily same political beliefs. The other thing I would say is that they all have this belief that there's this sort of leftist position that's taken hold within academic campuses and within major institutions, and they're quite critical of that. Isn't this like the same kind of like thing happened, like I guess in the 90s, where someone sent a fake like academic paper to some journal. I can't remember the exact details, but
This physicist at NYU named something Sokal.
yes, that's one, Sokal, yeah.
He did something similar where he released an article, or he submitted a paper that was basically saying that all reality is socially constructed. He basically manufactured this whole scenario where he released two ideas that were totally different as a way of like making the journal that he released it to look foolish. So I don't know if the question is so much like, is this something new? But is it possible that this is an indication of a consolidation or a new alliances building within the intellectual dark web that could potentially push back in a more meaningful way on the conversations that have been happening on the left?
Like what connects all these arguments together? Is it just that academic standards have dropped? Is that the argument you think is happening?
I think it is that social justice theory reduces everything to race, and by doing so, like, leads to a form of racism.
Can we zoom in and like carve out like a particular signal here? Is it like the criticism of basically of the humanities, or is it of like cultural theory and critical theory? Like the criticism of what are termed SJWs on Twitter? What is the thread?
They were like academically shit posting, and then now they got a book published, and then now we're wondering if they're going to be a viable political force. Is that like the plot line? Kind of
that's exactly how I read the plot line here. Yeah.
That's just like a macro version of failing upwards, isn't it? Which happens all the time. So maybe you're right.
What does it mean, failing upwards?
Failing upwards is like, the colloquial term for like, mediocre, often white guys who enter into corporate settings and just manage to, maintain like a mediocre level of output. And then they continue to get promoted and promoted and promoted. And so if we apply that phrase here, it's like, okay, well, they were submitting fake reports to academic journals. And then now they got a book deal to publish a book, or maybe they're independently publishing it. And then now we're considering they're aligning with other people who have some type of political clout, no matter how problematic they might be. And now we're considering them a viable political force. And so like their power is incrementally growing in the same way that like the average people can fail upwards in corporate settings. And so that's why I used that phrase.
Like my version of the story would be like a bunch of centrist podcasters gave themselves a cool name, the intellectual dark web, claim to be made radioactive martyrs, start trolling the humanities with the old fake academic abstract gag.
That old chestnut.
Right.
Yeah.
It's hard to see like what it is, but like, is there hindsight kind of idea of like what people are claiming this moment could be like in terms of something cohering around this group?
I think that over the last few weeks, it's somewhat accelerated out of academia and into journalism, which has been interesting. So like, a few people specifically have left like their posts, and like high profile people that have started writing on Substack, like Matt Taibbi, Andrew Sullivan, and Barry Weiss.
Yeah.
There is a lot of movement and conversations that are happening among those people. And I wonder, is there a way for those conversations to sort of coalesce into something coherent that could meaningfully bring together and bring closer some of the more radical elements of critical theory and other more liberal components of like more centrist classic liberalism? Like, is there a way of merging those worlds? And the left needs to consolidate in order to get its agenda done.
Right. That would be like the signal that like some of what's going on, like, yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple of things here, Sam. Like, some of the people that you mentioned, I don't think they would call themselves classical liberals either. People like Matt Taibbi, they're quite progressive. They're further left than I think a lot of the other people that you've spoken about. I think what they're all looking for, however, is like kind of aligning on the point that there needs to be more kind of open dialogue. And there are people who try to do that, right? So like a case of the Harper letter. Harper put together this letter trying to collect a bunch of values that everyone across the political spectrum and across, different interest groups could align to and say that these are values that we all kind of believe in, and basically calling for like open dialogue and moving away from quote unquote what's been called cancel culture, right? That was a whole shit show too. Like a lot of people were called out for like participating in it. So I think something like that, like the Harper's letter, might have been more a point of coherence that I think you're looking for, instead of this like Cynical Theories book or whatever it's called, which is like, I think there's like a few things happening here. One is that it's like trying to take down like academic institutions and making a case for academic institutions failing like the standards of rigor that we want them to have. And then also making a case about like cancel culture and like state of discourse on social media and so on, and calling for the need for this sort of dark web, which is outside the clear, open, public square conversations that are happening, just to be safe. So I just don't, like, I'm not totally sure if the Cynical Theories book is, you know, the point of coherence, or it might look like the point of coherence that you're looking for might be something like what Harper's tried to do, but actually failed, possibly. I don't know, did anyone else follow the Harper's thing? Sid, you might know more about it since being in media.
Yeah, I remember seeing it when it came out, and I think it kind of happened maybe around same time of like when J.K. Rowling like really just like went off on her like little turf letter that she was like, she's like, people are going to cancel me for this, and then they did, and then she joined this letter along with hundreds of other people who were in this letter, like, and we were just talking about the Daily before starting recording, and the Daily just did a thing on cancel culture, and I just started listening to it yesterday. But to me, like the fear of cancel culture is just the fear of like a dominant group afraid of losing their power to a less dominant group. Like
I agree.
You know, like it goes back to this book that Rob and I have talked about often that I'm still moving very slowly through, called Conflict is Not Abuse. And it's just this idea that like just because we're disagreeing on something, or just because a conversation that has been historically had in the margins is now able to take center stage on Twitter, like your rights are not being infringed upon. You know, like the people being afraid of cancel culture and say it's gone too far is just to me another form of gaslighting.
Especially in this case where it's like all these guys who feel like they're being silenced, they seem to be taking that point of view when in fact like they just have like,
you're just being deprioritized.
They're just like, it's ridiculous from the perspective of like the Sam Harrises and Eric Weinsteins and so on. And like, I think Eric Weinstein in particular, like loves to position himself as the underdog.
And like a victim?
Yeah, and it's like, that's the narrative that he's going for. And I think that the failing upwards idea was actually really interesting, because these are all people that I find have done some interesting thinking at some point across the board. And I would say have all become increasingly mediocre over time. So that's a curious case too.
And that they get to maintain their position of power in society,
and act like they're being canceled or something.
If
their audience grows.
Not to mention that as they continue to talk about it, they're getting more and more attention.
Yeah, exactly.
It's signal that just popped to mind within this, and I always like the like neologism and slang term signals, is the use of the term social justice warriors or SJW as like a derogatory term. And I remember I did some social scanning, I don't know, probably 2015, 16, and like included it as a signal on a scan at that time. Looking at that now, there may be some examples where it's like warranted to use it in a derogatory way, but as a general thing, it's like, I'm not sure I want to live in a world where social justice warrior is like an insult, you know? Like sounds like very dangerous. Like that sounds like whoever is like pointing that finger, historically, like how likely are you to be on the right side of things?
I feel like that was happening for like a while, where like using that term social justice warrior in a derogatory way was like increasingly like calling someone like the F word, you know, or saying like someone's retarded. Like it's just like, you don't say that anymore. Like that's not okay. But then I feel like especially, you know, throughout this like past like 3 months of like this like uprising and racial reckoning, like much belated, it's introduced like so many new race words to people, you know, like that my corporate job is saying anti-racism is like, whoa, you know, like that is a word that people know now. So maybe you could track the correlation of like, it's not okay to say SJW in a derogatory way with the increase of people being like, I know what anti-racism means, you know, maybe they're correlated.
I feel like there is some definite network of signals that show that there is some cohesion forming around, let's say, Occupy Wall Street, like the criticisms that were like, what are they asking for? Same criticisms were made of like Black Lives Matter in 2016. And there's just been increased clarity, understanding about, you know, organization and articulation of what the issues are and what's needed to be changed. And it's becoming like just much more tactical. Like if anything, that's where I see that there's something forming where it's a lot of these criticisms are just losing validity in terms of like it's more and more obvious that you're talking about like really fringe groups when you criticize some of these movements, not the whole though.
If SJW was like the pejorative of like the mid 2010s, like the pejorative for the pandemic era is Karen, you know, which is like a completely different archetype. It's so different from the SJWs.
But how is it similar? It's interesting to kind of think about how they're similar too. Like they're both gendered.
They both are gendered is an interesting point.
You feel SJW is gendered?
Yes, for sure.
I would say gendered, and then also just like the way that it's used, you know, as in any derogatory term. I guess this is not profound. It's just like, oh, you're so naive and you're so ignorant and you don't know what you're talking about, kind of thing for both of them. Like, oh, you're such a like Karen, a boomer, a SJW,
like a shrill, ignorant person is like the way I would characterize it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like oblivious to reality in some way. It's outwardly expressing something with a lot of passion, but like you don't realize that the way that you're coming off to the people around you.
Yeah,
right?
it's like utopic, but they both have definitely different versions of utopia. You know,
Mm-hmm.
like that your utopia is dumb, basically.
Macy, signal or noise?
I don't know.
Where did we go? Where did we land?
Where do we start from?
What are we appraising? I don't
We're through a
remember.
maze and we're not out of it. Signals among noise.
Can we say what the signal is?
Yeah, can we like succinctly explain it?
Stop trolling the humanities.
Agreement among previously divided factions of liberalism, or people on the left.
Signal agree. Yeah, that would. I mean, I guess that signal remains to be seen. I think the cool signal here is for sure academic shit posting, as coined by Sydney Allen Ash a few minutes ago. Like that's kind of interesting and like maybe a new like art form to play with.
Performance art.
You can do, yeah.
That's what a PhD is. A PhD is just performance art.
In some way, like that's the most postmodern like thing they could have done. Like you could probably go and like cite them and like find something valid. Like that would be the ultimate kind of way to get back at them, right? Would be to like then go and start like citing these papers and like reinterpreting them as like great points that these guys are making.
That's what happened with the criticism for the Sokol paper in the 90s, where like this is physicist who just like sent in this paper. And then like he was like, oh, haha, like, you know, this journal it has such low standards that they accepted my nonsense paper. And then they went in point by point and they were like, oh no, like, you know, this is a reason why we thought it was interesting. And like, like they actually like cited it in a couple of places. And it was like,
so as it turns out, like a good academic can adequately argue both sides of something
Right.
relatively well.
Yeah. And also, as it turns out, all the best ideas start as jokes.
Or that just having the power of an institution behind you allows you to do whatever the fuck you want.
yeah, that's somewhat true too.
Very true.
But these days, like having an institution behind you, particularly among the people who are talking about cancel culture, is seen as like a risk. If you have your own platform, you can't be canceled, because the worst form of canceling, once the Twitter breeze dies down, is losing your job.
I mean, that's like the traditional consequence of canceling is losing your job, but there's a myriad of alternative consequences, I guess.
I think a lot of this comes down to what are the ways in which people or institutions or organizations are held accountable. In certain cases, the accountability happens by, you know, reporting up to somebody's manager. And within an academic institution, it might be reporting up to the dean or something like that. In certain cases where that's not possible, or where the institution is too strong, you know, you have to have some sort of collective bargaining power, which is how canceling usually happens, right? It's like people like congregating on Twitter and being like, oh, actually, we're not going to like, you know, listen to your new comedy special or whatever it is, because like, you know, you did this one action that, you know, we don't agree with or whatever. And I guess in this case, this is also a way of canceling an institution by like submitting this and show like kind of like holding them accountable by saying, okay, well, you know, your academic standards are so low that you've accepted my nonsense like paper or whatever. Well, yeah, we've just talked about like a bunch of like accountability strategies. Like I guess that's how I would summarize this whole conversation.
I like what you said, Udit, about Twitter kind of being like paralleling it to collective bargaining power. It made me think about unions and like as work becomes, you know, increasingly decentralized and, you know, gig economies and no one's going back into an office anytime soon and whatever. It's like, it's interesting to think about like what are the new unions, like freelancer unions, and how union culture is like also connected to like this protester movement, like Black Lives Matter movement. I don't know. That's kind of interesting that you use that word though. It's
like a consumer union or something.
It is like a consumer union, yeah, because I mean, the work that we're doing is, you know, interacting with stuff on the internet, which is making other people money, right? So that's the equivalent. We are striking, you know, when we are canceling somebody, I guess, or like attempting to boycott something. However effective or ineffective it may be, that's like the equivalent.
How about it as a signal that's sort of like counter postmodernism as an aesthetic movement? Things being what they are, things being less dilettantish, things being like just moving away from that. And like even this whole idea of like cohering around like an actual set of values, like there's a bunch of things. I've used the word cohere several times here, so like the idea that like things that are like messy, where we're picking from a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit that, you know what I mean? In order to like form a PhD thesis or a movement of intellectual dark web or a leftist movement or whatever, moving into something that is much more like, let me just outline exactly what I'm talking about clearly in like real human language, which can be like sort of complicated rather than complex, and like can obfuscate like the points that are being made or they aren't formed yet. That we're kind of like moving into like counter postmodernism, postmodernism, whatever.
So is it just people trying to make sense of things?
The age of making sense sense without saying Sam Harris.
I was thinking about that a little bit last night, just like about how the language of protests is so succinct, like defund the police, for example, or abolish the police, or NYPD suck my dick, or whatever you want to say. Like they're all really short and succinct. And I was thinking about how like the evolution of like really succinct language, and like not diving into that argument, like, oh, we've lost all of our long-term focusing abilities, like not that, like the succinctness of language, like as seen in protest posters, which is like has its own lineage, but then also looking at like Twitter and like how short that is, and like captions and like these little like oh, it's the for me, like that kind of thing on TikTok too, like just these short phrases, and like what does that mean, like what does this succinctness of language and how direct it is and how it's become this like shorthand, like what does that mean, like what is that? Maybe it's connected to what you're saying, I think, if I understood it correctly. But its face is
I'm just trying to make sense of like
it's related, but I feel like it could also be the only, because when I think of like the moments where things are much more chaotic, it's many signs saying many different things. Like if I were just use the metaphor of like protest signs or whatever, or just literally use protest signs and slogans and things, like it's many and it's messy necessarily, and it's fine. But there's also like we're creating a lot of clarity. And I do feel like we're seeing a lot of that these days. Like there's quite a bit of clarity if you're willing to look a little bit these days in some of these complex issues, I think.
What's like an example of something that has done the clarity thing well?
Well, the example I would give is immediately following George Floyd and like all of the rioting and so on that was happening, the translation of like entire field of studies of like Black feminist theory into like memes that are actually in many cases done really well, and of course like limited in terms of like how much they're able to say, but still like extremely like clear, like getting through to lots of people, like reaching this huge audience. And the sort of like ability of the movement of whoever is making them, to do this, that like succinctly summarize in useful ways and that can actually like change minds. You need theory sometimes to like wrap your head around things that just like don't fit into regular language. It's like there's so much complexity, but later you can then transliterate it from theory to like meme and do a big part of the job, a big part of the heavy lifting that the theory was doing initially.
So is it essentially making knowledge more accessible?
Memes as gateways?
Yeah. Because I mean, like a big part of why sometimes like established systems seem so complex to people is that, think about the legal system as a prime example, like it's just so hard to understand the steps to go through it. But once you are able to understand the steps, is like pretty much anyone can do it. But it is that like translation piece.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison, the legal system to like a whole entire sort of canon of Black feminist theory in terms of like intelligibility.
Like memes as a shorthand to enable systems thinking, like memes as in like the visual meme, but also as in like these little like phrases that are used.
Like the verbal memes, phrasal memes.
The verbal memes, exactly.
Which is
like,
more what I'm talking about. Is the verbal.
The verbal memes. Okay. Well, I mean, either of them really like as a way of, like a shorthand to help unpack interconnected systems of oppression, of knowledge, of whatever power.
The general literacy around very like kind of dense words that have come out of like jargon, basically, that have come out of theory. I think just the general literacy around those words is much higher, I think, than has ever been before. And people actually, when they talk about words like socialism, like I think people understand what that means a lot more clearly than they ever have in the past. And I think a lot of that has to do with the current movements that are happening after the pandemic.
Interesting take, yeah. Signal and noise, would it?
I'm not sure what the signal is, so I'm going to say noise.
Sid?
I think noise, in the way that I am understanding this, I haven't heard this before. Is that how I would characterize a noise? It's like it's either not relevant, or it's like so relevant that you don't need to identify as a signal.
Yeah.
No?
Sure. Yeah.
There's a bunch of ways that we could define noise.
Okay. Yeah.
That's a broken framework.
Well, we should replace it with a meme.
Okay. I am going with like, there's some kind of a signal for me in academic shit posting. There's a bit of a like wait and see what happens with like the book. That I would say is like signal in the sense of like we're tracking. And then my other take is noise. And I'll try and repeat again this like scrawl that I've written here, but a bunch of centrist podcasters gave themselves a cool name, the intellectual dark web, claimed to be made radioactive martyrs, slowly creating insidious personality cults, trolling the humanities with the old fake academic abstract gig.
We should have given you a beat.
Yeah, I know. I'm gonna have to practice that. Udit, what's your weakest signal?
Okay, my signal is WeedCo, which is a weed removal company, but it's a company that operates inside of the super popular social simulator video game called Animal Crossing, which I'm sure you guys have all heard of by now. So in case you haven't heard of Animal Crossing is a game that was made by Nintendo. And basically when you start the game, you're given this deserted island and you have to kind of set up and maintain it. And you can have your friends come and visit you. And like, I think your goal as an individual player is to start a community and have a bunch of these like anthropomorphic animals live kind of happy, fulfilling life. But one of the features of these islands that you have to set up are these weeds, which don't actually have any purpose for the players. They're just kind of annoying and they're a nuisance. And because the game kind of operates in real time, it takes a long time to remove all the weeds. So this company, WeedCo, is like offering a service to go and clean up people's islands and remove their weeds. And the thing that I found interesting about it is that it's a legit company in the way that it's operating. Like you can book this person online through like this online booking service, or you can book them through tweeting at them using this hashtag called, the hashtag is #requestweedco. They have this full onboarding process for new employees who want to work for them. And they've like released a bunch of their training videos. Because actually like the process of removing weeds is not actually that simple, because you have to make sure that you're not like stepping on the flowers on your island or whatever. And it takes a lot of effort to kind of get good at it and do it efficiently. So they have like this elaborate series of like training videos to like help people or help the employees learn the process of weeding islands. The employees, and I found a bunch of employees on Twitter, they have roles and responsibilities. Like this person is like a head of marketing that I found on Twitter, and she has like a business card, and she has like an employee Twitter handle that she tweets from. And they have like these elaborate kind of marketing initiatives as well. So currently they're running a community design contest where their customers like sending in entries for some design within the game. I don't actually play Animal Crossing, so if I'm getting some of the terminology wrong, please forgive. The other thing that I found interesting about them is that they don't charge any fees. So this is all kind of happening without any financial kind of compensation for the employees. But they're super popular. I found a bunch of their postings on Reddit. There are people just lining up for their services, and people are very excited to even work for them. So if you look at their mentions on Twitter, people are like, oh, like, can I work for you? This sounds like a dream job. How do I apply? According to one post by the founder, it seems like they're getting a lot of tips through in-game currencies, which are, I don't know if they're actually redeemable for actual money. Yeah, so that's my signal. The thing that I was thinking about when I was reading this was, is this a real company? Also, like, it's like performing like a real company. It's acting out like a real company. It's performing a service, but there's no kind of return. Yeah, is it a company or is it an art project?
Yeah.
Right?
I often ask that about From Later. Yeah. So it's free. So there's no business model per se other than like tips.
Yeah, it's no business model. But apparently they're making a fair amount of not money, but like whatever the in-game assets that they're receiving are decent.
But I guess for the employees is like, it's a form of gain. Like I have time, I kind of want to do something this might be meditative or something.
Do they have a in-person weeding company?
No, it's an only Animal Crossing weeding company.
Do these skills translate to real life?
Maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was wondering the same, like, are these people who are eager to be employed by them also curious about becoming landscapers and gardeners?
I don't know if the skills translate necessarily, right?
So do you think that it could just be the beginnings of a real company? Like that this is what they do right now to gain goodwill and brand equity, and then the t-shirt line comes out in a month, you know, and then something else happens, you know, where they make an offshoot of the game. Like I've never played Animal Crossing either, but like, do you think that that's possible?
It kind of feels like a real company to me, yeah. And I think it's like the start of a real company. And I'm going to complicate this whole signal a little bit more by saying this entire like online political discourse trying to like theorize the sorts of economies that exist within Animal Crossing. So some people have been talking about it being like this full-on capitalist hellscape where people are just trying to make money off of each other, and it's like replicating the kind of like capitalist infrastructures and economies that exist in the real life, right? And then on the other hand, people are talking about it being this like communist utopia where people are willing to share and just like put in their time and like give, like exchange based on like a sense of like solidarity and mutual helping or whatever.
Right. It's kind of cool how it's playing in between, and it's like no one can really claim which it is.
Yeah. So you can go online right now and buy like in-game assets for like a lot of money. And there are people who are like charging entry fees for entry onto the islands, which is like, I guess, the capitalist side. And then there are all these like subreddits and little like online communities. There's the one that I found, which I was looking at today, it's called No Fee AC, which is basically no fee Animal Crossing, which is like a bunch of people doing exchanges outside of the whole capitalist economy that's forming within Animal Crossing.
I was just thinking back to like, you know, what my Animal Crossing was, which was like Sims.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
like the Sims, they didn't have jobs. They at least I don't remember them having jobs. Mine never had jobs. Maybe I had too many cheat codes, but they like didn't do work. They just like, they like ate food and like set their kitchen on fire. And then when you got to like, you had the expansion pack, then they could have sex and
Right.
you could build houses, you could tear down houses, you could set houses on fire. And that was it. Like you couldn't work. And so isn't that interesting how like Animal Crossing, I mean, I'm sure that there's probably more to do than just work, but like it reminds me of Farmville too, where you're like essentially just working, you know, and like why was my Farmville The Sims where they didn't work, and why is Farmville and now Animal Crossing where there is work, you know?
I think people want mundane, repetitive jobs that are somewhat physical. Or at least physical simulation.
For your fingers.
I think it's like meditative, as Macy said. I think it's like, you know, the repetition gives, I think, people a sense of certainty when there might not be any outside of this contained, cocooned environment.
And like gratification with a weeded lawn.
Yeah. And you get to see an outcome, right? Like you get to work for a time and see returns on like the work that you put in, which might be, again, uncertain in the current world.
Those are really nice. But like, or could it be that we are like so like
We need to work.
like so institutionalized by capitalism that we must replicate it everywhere to have a sense of stability and control in our lives. Like,
yes,
right?
it's a full Pavlovian, like our Pavlovian impulses to like always like resort to our capitalist.
Esther Perel, who's like a couples therapist, she says that you replicate the imbalances that you had as a child, you know, in your relational dynamics. You replicate those as an adult, whether or not they're good for you or bad for you. So it's the same thing in this. It's like we were raised to exploit, and now in every situation we just must continue exploiting.
Yeah, it's fully mirrored.
We've talked about the lack of imagination in simulations, and like even the fact that we think when we're doing something virtually that we should simulate anything, like it's so unimaginative. It's as though we don't have the real world here, and as though we couldn't make like any fantasy happening, that it's like, oh, we must dream of labor even in our virtual worlds, you know? On the other hand, it's about time those Sims got a job. They've been having a free ride for too long.
But I guess also like Neopets, like that was kind of work.
Oh, Neopets.
Neopets was kind of work. Like I don't really remember what I did with the Neopet, or like a Tamagotchi, you know? Maybe it is more altruistic than I'm making it sound. Maybe we just like to care for things.
Yeah.
What would be different about this moment as compared to like the early 2000s? Like, why would we not work at that time? And we would now it's like we have to reproduce that
I mean, individually, like I was a child.
But the game designers weren't, though.
Fair.
Animal Crossing is like popular across the board. There are like, younger people playing it, but there are also a lot of older folks playing. Because the other thing to keep in mind here is that it's like very interactive, right? Like you're actually interacting with real people also. It's not just your avatar or whatever. Like you can go and visit your friends in this game world. The exchange that's happening, yes, it's within the game, but in some ways it's also real in that like, this is a real person. And at least like in terms of goodwill and like feeling good about an exchange, like you're carrying that over from like the fake world to the real world for sure.
To come back to this question of like business model briefly, if I can, I think the way that you put it, how like there's like this sort of communistic and capitalistic mode that are both being used. I feel like there's two interpretations of like what they're up to now that sort of align with both of those different aspects. So like on the one, there's like the sort of like the condition of modern capitalism where it's like audience follows the money. It's like audience first and then it's like you either like growth hacking. Yeah, exactly. And then the other interpretation, which is I think actually a little bit more interesting, which is that like if you do something of value, then money will come eventually. They don't need to have money right now. It doesn't have to translate into anything right now because like they know it's of value. So like as they continue to provide that value, it's that new tools allow us to provide value to other people without this sort of trust that, and it's similar to like Patreon, for example, where like if you add value to other people, like just by doing something creative or interesting or whatever, that this sort of money will come from that value, as opposed to we charge you $10 per weed.
Yeah, I would argue that there might also be a third angle here, which is like the value that these people are getting it cannot be necessarily financially compensated. The actual value of like providing, like feeling good in providing a service and like helping other people out and like finding a way to like interact with other people through this entry point, which is like a service, like a business or a service, but it's not actually about that. It's actually like just like meeting new people, interacting with others through this game. Like it can be a business where something is happening, but they're not necessarily like making money.
They can just be facilitating the connection.
I don't know though. I wonder like what they're going to decide over time. I wonder if they're going to actually become a company trying to make money, or it might be a company that never makes money and the exchange is just like service and people still want to work there because, they enjoy it.
Community garden.
Yeah.
Signal or noise, Sam?
I think it's a signal. I think it's a signal of a few things. Like, I think it's a signal of real world behaviors taking place in like a multiverse. Mm-hmm. But I guess that's, tracked in, that's in a few different places. I think it's a signal of new forms of organization building in radically digital spaces.
May I see signal or noise?
I would like to hope as a signal for us putting more value on these kind of principles like solidarity and mutual aid and exchange, not necessarily for monetary compensation.
Signal the symbol. I like that. Sid?
I hope it could be potentially a signal of mutual aid, alternative, maybe not whole economies, but just the difference between, I can't remember, I think it was Sam who you articulated this, like the difference between like charging for something versus the value of what that thing is worth and people giving the money rather than you asking for it. And it's still results in money leaving my hand and going into someone else's, but the feeling is different. And so it's a signal of that becoming more popular, I think.
Like a patronage or tip model.
Yeah. But even tip, like, yeah, maybe not tip, but maybe patronage. Yeah.
I mean, I find that conversation, I like to think of it as like landscaping company versus community garden. But then we're like community garden where maybe like you get like Levi's sponsorships and do photo shoots of your attractive like community garden people or whatever. I don't know,
right.
Like how you fund it and like do good and make it hip or something like that. I don't know. That's where it seems to go. I was also like, if I find out that this is like a Nintendo funded industry plant, I'll be so mad that we talked about it, at all. And it's just like weak signal shit posting like to get broadcast from
Astroturfing.
Yeah. Astroturfing, yeah.
Which is hilarious because it's actually literally
yeah, it's
Astroturfing weed.
the whole conceit we're going through here. So I don't know. I think overall I'm going to go noise because I feel like this sort of thing's been happening like since Second Life. It's like not a new signal like sent right earlier. Like, but it's cool if it's like fully automated luxury sex sim communism. Hooray for that. Sid, what's your weakest signal?
Partially, most recently looking at the WAP song with Cardi and Megan Thee Stallion.
Is everyone familiar with the WAP song?
Are we all familiar?
What does WAP stand for, Sydney Allen Ash?
Wet ass pussy. That's what WAP stands for.
Yeah. Okay.
So the song came out like last week, I think, with Cardi and Megan Thee Stallion, and the video is them in this weird funhouse Alice in Wonderland situation. They open the doors. There's all these hot girls in all the different rooms. Like Normani's there, Kylie's there. She's walking down the hallway. Everyone hates that because she's Kylie. But and then there's like a few other rooms with a few other people in it, and there's like some girls who are sex workers in the video, or at least like that's like they have OnlyFans accounts, and it's like that's their whole thing. I don't think they would call themselves sex workers, but whatever. So that video and that song, and then also looking at TV show P Valley. It's about strippers in the South, and it was originally called Pussy Valley. It's directed by Karina Evans, who's from Toronto. Fun fact. So Pussy Valley, P Valley. And then before that, there was Hustlers, the movie with J-Lo, about strippers, whole thing. So all of that, Beyonce's verse on Savage, where she says, might make it OnlyFans or whatever, the rise in OnlyFans use and membership. All of these things combined bring me a lot of joy, but also I think point to the mainstreaming of sex work and the culture adjacent and surrounding that. And one, I think that sex workers and anyone adjacent to that kind of like culture or industry becoming mainstream influencers, like for sure. I feel like that's already happening. But then to me, the auxiliary benefit of that is that sex work will become like actually decriminalized. And all of these things coming together are maybe like signals or like a general signal of like actually us reaching that point of like sex work becoming decriminalized.
All sex work or virtual sex work?
Like
mediated, digitally mediated.
Yeah. I think all of it in my head, all of it. Like, it would probably, because is OnlyFans technically illegal? I don't know. I'm not sure.
OnlyFans is definitely legal.
It's definitely legal. Yeah. So then in-person sex work is the criminalized part of it. It might not be actually like illegal, but
that are illegal to do on OnlyFans. I don't know. Like,
yeah, maybe.
But
in my head, what this will eventually lead to at some point in the hopefully not too distant future is like the decriminalization and hopefully cultural destigmatization of sex work.
You mentioned that let's say call them OnlyFans stars or whatever that are in this video wouldn't probably call themselves sex workers.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read enough about them talking about themselves, but like, one of them, I think her name is Suki Hana, I want to say, and her Instagram is Suki with like the good coochie or something like that. Let me look it up. So I quote her because I put respect on her name.
It's a little different, right? Like it's closer to a strip club than sort of an exchange of like a prostitution or something.
True.
Yeah.
So like adult entertainment or something like that. What I see as like the signal there maybe is just around sort of like an extension of what we've seen on other platforms where people are having a voice, but now it's like video quite recently has got into like the live streaming quality that it's at, where we can have this conversation that we're having right now without, minimal glitches and so on. So is this signal just that is that the empowerment to be able to go and like make some money independently, doing whatever it is that you do, like selling what you sell. And like, so there's a lot of cutting out of like the middlemen or what, that create the venues that would be strip clubs and so on when like live is required. And that seems like pretty powerful here. There's no need for any sort of other
governance.
Yeah. Management or, running of a venue or anything outside of women themselves running their own accounts. Right.
I mean, you could argue whoever runs the site is probably.
I'm sure OnlyFans is, they're winning. You're right. if that's like, so that becomes like the Amazon of strip clubs.
Yeah. But I feel like because there's like so much more palatability mainstream to even just talk about OnlyFans, like pre-COVID, was anyone really talking about it in a mainstream fashion? Like not really, you know? So just like the rapid palatability of OnlyFans to me indicates that this like journey is not done yet, you know, and that like, yes, we could end this signal at just talking about OnlyFans, but to me, it's like connected to like a larger, you know, domino falling about like actual sex work and actual sex workers, you know?
Low-key, quick plug from later offers consulting on OnlyFans. So.
Hey.
This sort of ties into a signal that I was actually planning on bringing, which is this app called Seeking Arrangements. It's basically an application that connects sugar babies to sugar daddies.
Yeah.
And so like, I mean, this type of thing has been around for a long time, but there's two things that I found really interesting. And one is that their most recent marketing campaign, it's called Sugar Daddy University. And how they're sort of framing it is as like a wealth transference from an older generation to millennials who are unable to like pay for college. I guess it's partly like just understanding their user demographics and saying like, hey, these people are mostly using this to pay for college. But the other interesting component of it is like, it's a lot of the language that they're using is around like mutually beneficial relationships. And so it's like, they're using a lot of the right language around like having like contracts and speaking about these things like in detail and knowing exactly what are the like forms of exchange and making sure that all of these things are sorted out in advance. And what I find it interesting and how it sort of supports the signal that you brought, Sid, is like this idea of like normalizing these otherwise like taboo forms of like sexual relationships through like open communication and formalization of these things and like leaning into them as opposed to like shying away from it. And that like these mediums are allowing us to have these conversations and open up this space where like, I guess corny to say, but like sex is being disrupted in all these funny ways. And I agree with you that just on the level of like sentiment, like a lot of the norms of like what's considered like okay or permissible behaviors is definitely changing.
The whole OnlyFans things, I think it's really interesting. I'm like concerned about like kind of like the extension of the gig economy into like other aspects of our personal lives. I don't know. I'm like concerned that there's this general feeling that everyone should take all aspects of their lives and like be an entrepreneur and make money, you know, in a way that they are, again, like atomized and don't have like collective bargaining, which they might have had if you had an institution behind you, right? Or like, you know, we're working together as a group. I'm not sure if it's all going to be positive in the next like few years.
I don't think it'll all be positive, but I think it's interesting to plot what you just said against like what could actually be like the outcome if sex work was actually decriminalized is like, okay, like, yes, don't agree with everyone monetizing every aspect of their lives. Don't wish that reality, you know, that every single thing, but a lot of people choose to monetize sex for their jobs. And so if that is if that's your chosen discipline, right, or career path or job or whatever the fuck, then great. And take that argument further, even beyond OnlyFans into sex work in general. If sex work was decriminalized, they could unionize and they could have bargaining power.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Actually establish coalitions and be able to better, you know, protect themselves. When it's criminalized, it's actually more dangerous for them and it's more likely to be exploited, right? So yeah, I think that it's maybe two separate things. Like, no, I do not wish everybody having to monetize every aspect of their being, but however people do choose to monetize themselves, you know, their skill set or their body or whatever it is, like I want people to be safe doing that, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
So those are, two signals potentially. Udits is kind of like almost becomes the signal we were discussing a moment ago with regards to landscaping thing, like anything, like some activity in a game becoming a business, like just anything. Like I hear what you're saying though, Uda. You're just saying like you can have a hobby or you can enjoy sex or you can do something without necessarily like creating a channel and trying to like blow up or monetize it or whatever.
But if you choose to.
Like, I feel like traditionally the argument that conservatives make against the normalization of like sex work is like this, it's like a form of like the slippery slope argument, which is like, if you normalize it, then it becomes like a larger part of our society and family values will be compromised and et cetera. And I was not trying to characterize your argument as that at all. I just mean like, Will the change of norms lead to a shift in the market value, essentially?
If you look at like how platforms have affected the gig economy in general, right? Like what happens is there's a massive, massive hollowing that happens, right? So like 0.001% or 0.1% people actually make money off of most of these platforms, and most people do not. It becomes even more precarious for more people. And that's like the sort of thing that I'm concerned about. Like the standard effects that the gig economy has influenced a certain profession is like what I would be afraid of for sex work as well.
Yeah.
And also like the normalization of like everyone is an entrepreneur. Like this is sort of like neoliberal like idea that's like pervasive in business today. Is like, I don't know, I'm just a little bit afraid of that, like transferring over to other aspects of our personal lives.
So do you think this might lead to like self-governing bodies, like, have doulas, for example? I think there are like organizations showing up to support that profession, or almost like a professionalization of this as a job, promoting safe and best practices and like, educating people who choose to be in this role to be conscious of certain risks and stuff like that.
I'm hopeful of that for sure. Yeah.
Just like differentiating between like the platforms themselves and then sex workers who are operating in real life. I don't know, in real life versus digital life, whatever, like in person. Even throughout COVID and the quarantine, where we've seen an increase in OnlyFans usage and OnlyFans like content creators, there has been increasing precarity of the sex workers that were using that platform to begin with. And they've been like slowly booted off the platform or silenced, or they're making less money because there's all these amateurs on there. And like, I even heard at one point where OnlyFans was going to try and boot all sex workers. And like, what the fuck is your platform then? Like, it's the same thing with Tumblr. Tumblr had a plethora of porn on it, and then it got too mainstream, and then they took all the porn off. And it's like sex rules the internet, sex rules society. So like the idea that like sex work would become more popular in a potentially clutching our pearls kind of way, like God forbid, is not an accurate prediction based on history. Like sex work is like the first industry to take over any new technology. So the idea that decriminalizing it and that the popularization of it and destigmatization of sex work would lead to an increase, maybe, but really it's always been there. It's always been such a huge thriving industry. It's always been at the forefront of any new innovation, any new way of connecting with people. So it's just like, it's actually just making it safer for the people who are in it. But I think it's really important to differentiate like sex workers meeting in person from the platforms, because the platforms are inherently exploitative. But if there is a general in society decriminalization of sex work in general, then they can unionize and create coalitions and organizations similar to Macy, what you're saying about doulas.
Or Uda, do you think there could be like a platform cooperative movement for sex workers?
We're looking at you to design this, Uda.
That's what I would prefer over OnlyFans for sure.
What is that?
I don't know anything of OnlyFans, but like they exist. I mean, I'm sure alternatives exist. This is like a matter of like adding tipping to like existing video apps and stuff. Yeah.
That would be like a platform that's owned by the sex workers instead of owned by
designed by them as well, probably.
Yeah, like democratically controlled by the actual sex workers instead of it being a separate entity that's extractive.
And that would, I mean, that's going back to like the comment I made of just like a step towards like a certain type of empowerment here, which seems super doable. Like
yeah, for sure. I think it is doable. And I would hope that would happen.
Yeah. So if you listen to the genre of strip club music that is like very much in line with like this song where we started with here, there's frequent references, and there's a lot of men producing these like strip club anthems, and there's a lot of acknowledgement within hip hop that like songs blow up at the strip club first, and that like the women who dance at strip clubs like choose these songs. But there's a lot of references to universities, to college, to tuition. Tuition is a term that shows up in strip club rap songs way more than you would have probably thought. So here we have a thing like, to your point, Sid, about like if they want to, right? Well, as it turns out, a lot of people are doing this because it is prohibitively expensive to get an education in the US, right? And, that's for sure their prerogative and so on. But like that, there's like another signal within that. And it's like, if the cost of living and if certain things that should be accessible to people are not, like, is resulting in people entering this industry who otherwise might not. I at the risk of sounding conservative, I still think there is an argument to be made that sex should be sacred and not be.
I don't know. I just feel like sex and sex work are two different things. Like the sex that you have with your girlfriend or boyfriend is one thing, and then the sex that these people are doing for work or sexual acts of any kind is like something different. And I feel like trying to like moralize, I don't know, the argument there is like a little bit precarious, because like people go and work at McDonald's to afford university, or people go work at Amazon in the fucking warehouse, and that shit's super exploitative and so dangerous, you know. And we should be equally as concerned for all people in like in any precarious working situation, and we should be working to give more workers' rights to all people, you know, and
and to be clear, I'm not interested in like policing bodies, and I agree with everything you're saying there. But there is a difference between in both in like the potential revenue for some people and in the labor, between working at an Amazon warehouse and doing any sort of sexual act, right?
Yeah, I mean, if the
like, they're not exactly comparable, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, fair.
Because there's bad jobs, or like it might be worse or whatever. It doesn't like make like sex and packing boxes comparable.
Yes, obviously some people are making more money via sex work than they would have made at Amazon. But I don't think you're actually saying this, but I feel like the step further in the argument is like, we should not be looking for workers' rights for sex workers because sex is sacred.
I would be empower sex workers and make education free.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what I would argue for, is that
fuck Amazon.
Agreed.
Signal and noise, would it?
Signal.
Sam?
I think it's a signal.
Macy?
Yeah, I think it's a strong signal.
I agree. This seems like a signal. Macy, what's your weakest signal?
I think it's not super new, but particularly because of the pandemic, there's been a resurgence of obsession with labyrinths, and people either finding or building their own labyrinths like in their backyard, so they could like meditatively like walk through it, or even doing like finger tracings on Zooms. And there's also been like an increase of like courses for labyrinth facilitators to kind of develop like a global community of people who seek the sense of like inner peace and spiritual connection in like moving through these kind of structures. So they're saying like there is this kind of move towards like a worldwide labyrinth movement, and likening like labyrinths to quote unquote maps of the mind. So it's like having these physical structures and being immersed in it and almost like musing through it to take yourself to like an inner world, and allowing you to like get a bigger picture. I guess in a sense it's like tied to mindfulness, but I was just interested in how it's actually bringing people back to the physical space as opposed to like zooming into the virtual space as we're like in isolation, and also like being creative about making their own maze-like structures within whatever physical space that's available to them. Specialist designers to build it in their homes.
Cool. I like it.
Yeah, I like to go through one.
And what's the likening to maps of the mind? What's that about? What does that mean?
Yeah, who's saying that? Who's
so there are like these labyrinth societies and like other groups that are kind of promoting this movement, and I guess like the maps of the mind is just like in a sense the movement of going through these structures in a like, because I guess you're like coursing through it not necessarily with a goal to be like, I would need to solve this maze, but like I'm just going to meander through it, and in doing so they're saying you're like able to seek inner peace and a spiritual connection.
Who's they?
These organizations, there's like Labyrinth Society, there's like this organization called Veridita, and they essentially are creating this like community where they're training labyrinth facilitators, using it almost like as a healing and transformational channel.
The maps of the mind and labyrinth thing reminds me of memory palaces. Do you know? Does anyone know what that is?
Yeah.
That's like kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Like certainly it seems obvious, like walking through labyrinths would be meditative, walking in general be meditative. So I personally like took up a lot of walking and had a lot of different types of walking experiences than I'd ever had prior to the pandemic. So that all is quite relatable. But the idea that people are walking in like a specific formation, and that there's some kind of mind mapping one's own mind is very interesting. And I feel like I've seen many mazes that are sort of brain shaped almost, and like it's just like an interesting kind of like cognitive cartography or something to this idea, which is very memory palace.
Like I was saying, in addition to the walking, people just like tracing with their finger.
Just mazes, like when we were kids.
It kind of reminds me of this symbol in Westworlds. When you cut open the inside of the head of one of the robots, there's this like map which looks similar to a brain, which is supposed to be like a map of the park. And I think the symbolism there is this idea that, and the park itself is a metaphor and a symbol for the mapping of human consciousness and the nature of like personalities and the way that people operate. And like it's basically like this sort of data center that gathers information, plays out different scenarios for how people behave under different conditions, and then turns it into like an algorithm for understanding like how to manipulate people. So this concept of the map within this is this idea, it hints at almost like mind hacking, like trying to understand the like sort of the model of the mind so that you can better understand yourself and like grow and change and manipulate, like sort of hack the self. And the other is this idea of, it reminds me of the game you were talking about last week. What was the name of the game?
Randonautica.
Randonautica, yeah. So this idea that like through experiences that take you out of your normal reality and like involve some like sort of like problem solving and solution building, that you can like disorient yourself in an enlightening kind of way.
But I think this is like the opposite of aleatory, right? This is just like repetition and like being in like this reminds me of more like something like rosary beads, a chance or something like that, where you like do like find like a state of flow or something like that, like what people might call flow, by doing the same movement again and again and again, and kind of tap into some inner rhythm that you have by like doing the same thing again and again.
It's a cool little dichotomy or balance to think about, is this like patterned meditation versus chance sort of like meditative exploration. Chance inspiration versus pattern meditation.
I feel like there's that tie to time and space, but then as well I find like with Labyrinths there is like almost hidden elements as well, right? Like there are certain nooks and crannies, there are like, I mean, they're not necessarily rooms, but the structure of it, the dimensionality of it is also interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, the interesting thing is like what comes up, right? Like in all sort of meditative practices, especially when they're like kind of structured, it's like people always say they're bad at meditation. People who lead meditation always say like there's no such thing or whatever. But like ultimately at the end of it, like what has come up, what was keeping you from having like from entering flow state or whatever is like the interesting thing. So going through like doing something repetitive like that, there will be these elements of like chance even within your mind, and sort of like what are the things that pop up or like cut through the pattern or the repetition.
Rob, you and I have spoken about this, how at the beginning of quarantine, time and space were really distorted because, you know, living in an urban environment, often there's a lot more variety to your daily experiences. Like you're doing so many different things on like throughout the week, that like when all those things were cut out, it was super disorienting because every day just sort of blended into every other day. And it's like it allowed us to sort of see into the repeated like patterns of reality. And do you think like maybe there's a correlation between that experience of tapping into that sort of repetitiveness and continuity, but like of reality, like the blurriness of time and space, and an interest in this type of like walking mazy meditation? Is
it like in the sense that when you're in like a labyrinth, you kind of like time and space is kind of stretched out? Like, is that the point you're making? I'm trying to figure out like what is the correlation here.
Well, to sort of like come back to this idea of like a beads on a necklace, where you're repeating the same incantation over and over and just like counting as you're going through. And that like time has probably felt more similar to that like circular in the last few months than at other times.
Yeah.
And that, like, as a result of that, people have been finding this type of experience more compelling or closer to what the reality feels like right now.
In spatial terms, like if you're making a maze or a labyrinth, you maximize the amount of a single dimensional path in like a 2D space, right? So, you know, at a time when most people feel confined, finding like long pathways to walk on might be like something that's happening.
Yeah, maybe have more to do with space than time. But I don't know. You know, it's the relationship. I don't know, the phenomenology of time through this like experience of like going and returning. That seems like going to your job, going somewhere during the day and returning. The end of that was what threw off a lot of our experience of time.
Human perception of time is usually it's through like certain markers, right? Like you have like, oh, you do this thing at this time, you know, eat food at this time, you fall asleep at this time. When all of those markers are not there, then how do you even talk about time? Because you know, you don't really feel time the same way. You only have these activities to look at to like mark certain moments in time. Maybe the labyrinths help in some way, like the fact that you reach certain points within the labyrinth at certain time. I don't know. I think this whole space-time thing is a bit of a stretch. I think it's like
mazes are fun.
Mazes are fun.
Mazes are back.
Mazes are fun. Mazes are back.
So maybe it has something to do with like the relationship with like tasks, that through that act of going in the wrong direction and having to correct for it, there's something healing in it. Or maybe they're just cool and people are like trying to build these things.
How big is this, Macy? Like what is where is it happening?
It can be as small as like on your screen, or it can be like as big as like a giant field. There are ones like in France that are huge, right? And you can like...
These are all new? Like they've all happened?
No, these are not all new, but I think people are almost like taking solace in the act of going through a labyrinth, or like making it a ritual or something like that. I don't know what signal I'm trying to say, but
do you know the marble runs? So this is a huge spike. Yeah. This is a huge spike. This is like one of it's like one of the channels that has increased the most audience numbers since the pandemic started on YouTube. Yeah. And I wonder which came first. Like I wonder if it's like the YouTube thing that kicked it off, or if it was just like just a general trend of like putting together these like elaborate, repetitive structures where things kind of happen again and again.
It's kind of like sports or something, just like the idea that this is contained. It's like I'm going for this walk, and like though like eventually I know where I'm heading, like there's some level of like potential to like fail, but like eventually you're gonna find it, you're gonna find the destination point, and it's just this like closed, there's a beginning, there's an end kind of narrative, which is kind of gives you the same sort of simplicity that I think is why a lot of people enjoy sports, where it's just like finally something where we're just like, there's a winner, there's a loser, watch. It's like
there's a completion, and it takes time.
But also, like in taking the time, your mind might go elsewhere.
Well, Sam, you had a walking route, right?
I have 2 routes.
Right.
I have 2 different types of walks. I have my I'm going for a walk, which is my morning walk, where I repeat the same route over and over again. And then I have my evening walk, which is more of a saunter. It is meandering.
All right, signal and noise. Would it?
I think there's like something there to like these like repetitive, contained systems. Everything from rosary beads to marble runs to labyrinths. So I'd say I'm not sure like what it means yet, but I think there's something.
Sam?
I think there's something in mobile meditation and problem solving as part of that. But the signal itself, probably noise, I think.
I'm going to go with like clustering it with other kind of like new walking signals. I've seen a lot of signals around walking, and even like new publications emerging around walking out of Europe and stuff like that. So I think it's all part of like the peripatetic lifestyle. Broadcast from later.